Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, and welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that, according to many historians, Andrew Jackson genuinely believed he was doing the right thing, even the morally responsible thing, by enforcing the removal of Native Americans to the West? That Henry Clay, riding the wave of the debate over the veto of the rechartering of the bank, thought he had a chance to defeat Jackson in his re-election bid. And that after Clay was proven to be very, very wrong, all of Jackson's political opponents joined together to create a unified political force that had one mission: fight back against Andrew Jackson and his policies. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out, because today we will cover that and more in episode 127. Jackson wins re-election. All right, everyone, welcome into episode 127. Glad you could join me today. Book recommendation for today, and this is someone that we'll be talking about quite a bit today. This is the episode in the narrative of this podcast where we dive into Henry Clay a bit more. And so the book recommendation is an autobiography on Henry Clay that I really like. It is called Henry Clay, by David S. Heidler and Jeannie T. Heidler. So I'll be putting that up on the website and posting it as a book recommendation when I post this episode. Real quick before we dive into it, new iTunes review that I really liked that I want to read to you real briefly. It is from Barnacle. Well, I can't really say the second word in his iTunes name. I apologize if you're listening. But I'm not sure it's appropriate. But anyway, 5-star review. He said, for anyone like me who is a knowledge junkie and who also has an aspect of their job that involves monotonous, arduous, repetitive tasks like hauling soil and mulch, this is your jam. Being that I am a Baltimorean forever and used to crew on a small yacht that gave historical tours of the inner and outer harbors, culminating at Fort McHenry, I originally stumbled upon this podcast through a desire for more detailed understanding of the War of 1812. After listening to those episodes, I went straight back to the beginning, and now I am hooked. We'll be becoming a patron on Patreon as soon as money gets a little less tight. Thank you for this fantastic podcast that has helped me get past my hang-ups about the atrocities that led to the founding of the U.S. to actually feel patriotic, and thank you for going in-depth into the atrocities and injustices committed against the indigenous civilization that we stole land from. Cheers. Thank you for the review. Thank you for enjoying the podcast. I'm glad you went back to the beginning after you listened to the 1812 stuff. And just for me personally, it's always cool to hear, from people from Baltimore, since that's where I am. All right, so let's dive into episode 127. The last month, we've been diving deep into the first term of President Andrew Jackson. We covered the Petticoat Affair, the nullification crisis, his veto on the bank's charter, the Indian Removal Act, and his interpretation of the role of the federal government, right, which Bill and I talked about a lot last week. That is a lot of stuff that happened in one term of a guy's presidency. Today, we're going to keep our narrative moving, talking about Jackson winning re-election and seeing how he will set up to continue to execute his vision for America. Before we do that, though, I want to point out a poorly communicated aspect of the Indian Removal Act that really is my fault. Loyal listener Jennifer pointed out that I stated the Trail of Tears took place in 1838. This was in episode 125 when I was on with Zach. But in fact, the forced or semi-forced removal of Native Americans began as early as 1831. She mentioned that she is a member of the Choctaw Nation and pointed out that her people began their westward trek following the Dancing Rabbit Creek Treaty of 1831. And I want to point out and say to you and to Jennifer that she is 100% correct. In fact, there were multiple tribes that were forced west almost immediately following the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Over the next 8 years, from 1830 to 1838, there will be a mass exodus of natives from all over the Southeast into federal territory west of the Mississippi. The term Trail of Tears is often conveniently just applied to the Cherokees' trek in 1838, and that's what I was referencing in episode 125. But more accurately, it should be attributed to all the forced migration of Native Americans over this 8-year period. For me, in balancing the value of a chronological narrative while also trying to group events into digestible and understandable chunks, I decided to wait until 1838 to cover not just the infamous Cherokee Trail of Tears, but also provide context to the treaties and other examples of forced removal of natives during the 1830s. But, of course, I never told anyone that, so I understand if you think that I just sort of glossed over a lot of Native American relations. I didn't. I plan on going back to it, but I totally get it if you think I did. So, if you are still curious about some of the more detailed aspects of this monumental series of events in American history, don't worry, we are going to revisit it in Van Buren's presidency. So, now that I have hopefully cleared that up, let's get back to our narrative of President Jackson. In episode 125 and 126, Zach, Bill, and I referenced the Worcester v. Georgia decision from the Supreme Court that was ignored by Jackson. And I think one thing that's valuable to point out before I briefly give you some context into the relationship between Jackson and John Marshall is that by all accounts, Andrew Jackson genuinely believed that moving the natives west into federal territory was undeniably the best thing for them. Now, and when I say by all accounts, I mean by all of his accounts. Now, you could easily argue that, yeah, well, that just shows how prejudiced he was in the first place. The fact that he didn't recognize that this forced removal would destroy their culture and their history proves how little importance he placed upon them. Well, maybe. But one could easily counter that by pointing to the words spoken by Jackson in which he lamented the destruction and eradication through warfare and or disease of numerous other tribes since the first European fishermen landed in North America hundreds of years earlier. He pointed to a pattern in American history that was undeniable and had good reason to believe that if the natives continued to live in the southeastern part of the United States, they were going to continue to slowly lose their influence, culture, and livelihood. It had been happening for hundreds of years. Jackson believed he had no way to stop it. He could have sent in the military to enforce some type of martial law to stop it, but he wasn't willing to do that, and while in retrospect, we recognize that, maybe that could have been the right thing to do, I sort of understand why he wasn't quite willing to do it at the time. It was due to prejudice and greed that the Native Americans were losing their culture and their land, and it was rampant in parts of the country, and it wasn't going to disappear with the Supreme Court decision, at least not in Jackson's opinion. Now, hopefully, you know by now from listening to this podcast that I don't intend to try to convince you of one way or another. The deed has been done, and Jackson's legacy is already incredibly complex. I just wanted to give you perspectives on both sides of Jackson's decision here and allow you to determine for yourself how you want to feel about this infamous moment in American history. I think the only person in the history of this podcast that I've really gone after personally is Christopher Columbus, and that's just because I think the history on him is so little known, and some of the things he did were just really sort of shocking to me when I first heard them. And he's not American, so, I feel a little bit justified in being a little harder on him. Anyway, I mentioned that Andrew Jackson ignored a Supreme Court decision, and as you know, that was Worcester v. Georgia. But while we've mentioned it a couple of times, I want to explain briefly exactly what it said and why it being ignored led to a much bigger issue. So we know that Worcester v. Georgia stated that Native American tribes had distinct possession of their rights and their property, and that no state could pass laws that prohibited those rights and freedoms. This meant that negotiations with Native tribes should go through the federal government, just like any other sovereign nation. And it also pretty plainly stated that the federal government should not be passing laws denying them the right to their property, as that would be dispossessing them of this land that John Marshall and the Supreme Court said they had the right to possess. But because Jackson chose to ignore the decision, not only was the Indian Removal Act and its goals continually pursued, but Jackson did not do anything to stop Georgia or other states from passing state laws that were clearly limiting and inhibiting the rights of Native Americans, thus making it harder to justify refusing to leave their homeland. Right? If Native Americans feel like their rights are being trampled on by the state government time and time again, and no one's stepping in to do anything about it from the federal government, even though the Supreme Court said those laws are unconstitutional, then it's harder for them to justify to each other why they should continue to stay and put up with the abuse. Now, it's not shocking that Jackson ignored the decision. We've already talked about how Jackson didn't have as much respect for the Supreme Court as we have today, but he also just didn't like John Marshall. While Jackson's defense of national unity against the nullifiers certainly was strengthened with the nationalists like Marshall on the bench, Jackson didn't agree with much else Marshall did. Jackson believed that Marshall operated with a snobbery that was unbecoming. And like we mentioned last week, he really didn't like that the Supreme Court was full of men who were not elected, directly or indirectly, by the people. It was too undemocratic for Andrew Jackson. And he really didn't agree. On top of that, he didn't agree with his decision in Worcester v. Georgia. Jackson, by more or less ignoring this decision, reiterated that if natives wanted to stay in their state and refused to leave, they would need to abide by state laws, even if those laws were prejudiced against them. Literally the opposite of what the Supreme Court declared should happen. With this, Jackson's critics accused him of siding with the Georgia gold speculators and his political allies in the South. In the end, Jackson's belief that his policy was both liberal, just, and fair was not shared by many objective observers, and his claims that the natives could assimilate themselves in American society was believed by even fewer. I mean, the Cherokee had done a ton to assimilate themselves, yet they were still the focus of these prejudice policies. So when you think about it, Andrew Jackson seemed either a bit out of touch or being potentially purposefully misleading. Or maybe he just truly believed this and was far more hopeful than the average American. In the end, the state of Georgia was going to figure out a way to force the natives off of their land. And President Jackson was going to do nothing to stand in their way, even though it had been decided to be unconstitutional by a 5-1 majority in the Supreme Court. So now it's time to move on in our narrative, because everything we've covered so far in the last 5 episodes all happened in Jackson's first term. He still had a re-election to win. The election of 1832 was going to be a referendum on not just Jackson's overall policy, but specifically on the vetoing of the rechartering of the Bank of the U.S. And that is because his primary opponent in this election was going to be none other than the man who pushed it into public debate in the first place, Henry Clay. In all, 3 parties were primarily represented: the Democratic Republicans, the National Republicans, and the Anti-Masonic Party. All 3 used national conventions to choose their candidate, and this was actually the first time national conventions were used to determine their respective party's ticket. The conventions were held here in Baltimore, which will be the site of presidential conventions for many years to come in American history. The Democratic Republicans, with no opposition, chose Andrew Jackson to run for re-election as president, and replaced John C. Calhoun with Martin Van Buren as the vice presidential candidate. And while this likely isn't surprising to anyone who listens to this podcast, it wasn't a sure thing. In fact, many thought Calhoun still had a chance to serve as VP again, even after the Peggy Eaton affair and the nullification crisis. But if his relationship with Andrew Jackson was hanging on by a thread, it finally snapped when Calhoun broke the senatorial tie by not allowing his internal political rival, Martin Van Buren, to serve as the Minister of the UK, effectively attempting to end his political career. But 5 months later, when the convention gathered, Calhoun was clearly persona non grata, and Van Buren won the VP nomination in a landslide. The National Republicans put their best foot forward and ran Henry Clay, who will become known later in life as the Great Compromiser, as their presidential candidate, with Congressman George Sargent as the VP candidate, both men being chosen unanimously, just like Jackson. The third party in this election was the Anti-Masonic Party, who ran William Wirt, former Attorney General who rose to national fame as the prosecutor in Aaron Burr's treason trial. Wirt wasn't a great anti-Masonic candidate, since he was actually sort of a supporter of the Masons, but he was hoping his victory would lead to the National Republicans, who were convening later in the year, and it would lead to them throwing their support behind him. But once they chose Clay, he had no shot. Also, just as a side note, John Quincy Adams was willing to throw his hat into the ring and volunteered himself as presidential challenger to Andrew Jackson, but even the Anti-Masonic Party thought he was a bit too unpopular. So that shows just how far he had fallen outside the New England area. Now, some of you may be thinking, come on, Chris, there were more than 3 parties running, and that is technically correct. South Carolina, which would normally support a Southerner like Andrew Jackson and the Democratic-Republican ticket, refused to support Jackson because they were still angry at him over the nullification crisis. So instead, they did the politically expedient thing, and they formed a 4th party, the Nullifier Party, which ran the governor of Virginia, John Floyd, and then summarily won the state of South Carolina, which is the only state that they were even on the ballot. Yay, that was worth it. As I mentioned a few moments ago, the campaign of 1832 revolved primarily around the issue of Jackson's veto of the bank-free charter. Clay was hoping he could split up support in some of the states that seemed to favor Jackson and then win Pennsylvania, which was the home of the bank, right, because it's in Philadelphia. But Clay wasn't too optimistic about this plan. See, the veto of the bank-free charter did not go over the way Clay and his allies had hoped it would. Jackson's explanation for the veto, which we covered a handful of episodes ago, ended up being a political masterpiece, getting people on board with this idea that Jackson's interpretation of the Constitution was somehow more important and valuable than the Supreme Court's. It made Henry Clay, his political allies, and all the bankers look like plutocrats who were pushing for a monopoly of the moneyed interest. Jackson and his allies also made sure to point out that it was propped up by foreign money, and clearly its priorities were not helping the common man. Clay was furious. From his perspective, he knew that Jackson's constitutional arguments were flimsy, and he wasn't even sure Jackson believed it. Everyone in the know, quote-unquote, was aware that earlier in his life, Andrew Jackson had had issues with banks personally, and had held a grudge ever since, because, well, he's Andrew Jackson. From Clay's perspective, the bank wasn't perfect, but it was about as well run as one could possibly hope, and he couldn't believe that so many people were blinded by Jackson's harebrained attacks. To make matters worse, those politicians that did support the rechartering of the Bank of the United States were now being portrayed as the enemy of the people and their interest, because so many things in politics are often presented in such a binary way. Clay was beside himself. During the Senate's debates over the veto, because don't forget, Congress technically can override a presidential veto with 2/3 vote, so the veto isn't final, he pointed out that Jackson was throwing precedent out the window and taking presidential power to another level, a scary level. Clay had a point. Up to this point in American history, the veto had been used less than a dozen times, and all of those were because the piece of legislation was potentially unconstitutional. This was different, though. McCulloch v. Maryland had already deemed the Bank of the United States constitutional. Jackson was just doing this because he wanted to. That is incredibly dangerous, argued Clay, and flies in the face of the Founding Fathers' desire to have the legislative branch, the people's representatives, as the most powerful branch of the three. And this was true. Madison, along with others, often talked about how important it was that Congress had the most power in government. Clay was ranting and raving, pleading with his fellow representatives, exclaiming, quote, "How dare Andrew Jackson question the motives of any duly elected member of Congress for supporting the bank?" And I mean, when you think about it, this is the exact type of behavior they hated so much about the power of a monarch. By Jackson doing this, Clay argued, in the face of decades of precedent, he was more or less amplifying his own authority to the equivalent of 2/3 of Congress, which in Clay's mind was wholly unacceptable, and they needed to do something about it. Clay's little scheme to get Jackson to stick his foot in his mouth by vetoing the bank's charter was backfiring about as badly as Clay could have imagined, and soon he was going to have to pay the price at the voting booth. The campaign that Clay ran for 1832 is the campaign in which Jackson was given the King Andrew moniker, which Bill and I mentioned last episode, to point out just how much he was wantonly using the veto power. Clay was on his heels, but he still saw that there technically was a path to victory over Jackson. He was just less confident than he was when he and Biddle were initially scheming up their bank rechartering plan. Clay believed if he could hold on to the New England region and the Mid-Atlantic and start to make some inroads in the West, he could maybe pull it off. Jackson, in Clay's mind, had really upset the business and manufacturing communities with his veto, and Clay's American system of internal improvements and tariffs was something that would likely appeal to them. Unfortunately for Clay, much of his plan was based off the hope that the anti-Masons would abandon their plan to run William Wirt independently and would join Clay and the National Republicans as a unified coalition against Jackson. That never happened. And in retrospect, we know that even if it did, it still wouldn't have made the election even remotely close. The reality was that Martin Van Buren, the brains behind Jackson's rise to political power, had built a political machine around the cult of personality that was Andrew Jackson. And there was nothing that was going to be... There was not anyone or anything that was going to penetrate, at least not in 1832. But Clay knew this. The Democrats had an organized network of operatives all over the country to turn out the vote and disseminate political messaging and propaganda. The National Republicans had no such structure, and Clay was reduced down to writing letters to all his friends and allies around the country, asking them to please, pretty please, tell their friends to go vote for him. And it was about as effective as it sounds. As the results of the spring gubernatorial elections rolled in, so this is a handful of months before the fall presidential election, it wasn't looking good for Clay and the National Republicans. Fraud was rampant in Clay's home state of Kentucky, with Jackson supporters heading into the state to vote for Clay's ally and vote against Clay's ally in his home state. Heck, more people voted in this statewide election in Kentucky than there were eligible voters. Clay knew this spelled trouble for him in the fall, and when he got word months later that rumors were spreading that he had dropped out altogether, it became obvious to him that the political machine that Martin Van Buren had built was going to be relentless. In the fall of 1832, it became very clear as the results poured in that Clay was going to lose by a lot. The only thing he could possibly hope for was that the anti-Masons, who did not ally with him after all, like I mentioned, pulled enough of the vote to William Wirt to prevent Jackson from getting a majority of the electoral vote, potentially setting Clay up for corrupt bargain 2.0. Only this time he would be the one winning the presidency. But alas, it was not meant to be. Jackson crushed. He beat Clay 219 to 49 electoral votes, with the nullifiers getting 11 votes and the anti-Masons getting 7. Ouch. I mean, look, we all knew Jackson was popular and all, but this had to be a hit to Clay's ego. Clay viewed himself as a powerful and skilled politician who would make a great president. He truly believed that. Yet he had now run for president twice and lost both times to Andrew Jackson by a lot. Clay was so humiliated that Clay considered actually resigning from the Senate and giving up on politics, but he was talked out of it by some friends and close associates. He was in a rare state of depression. He just couldn't understand how the American people were still so enthused by Andrew Jackson, even after all of his controversy. Clay realized that maybe he didn't know the American people as well as he thought, and that is likely what bothered him the most. Jackson is one of only a few presidents to receive less popular votes in his re-election victory than he did in his first election victory, but it was clear Jackson was still incredibly popular. Jackson achieved a rare feat for his time, winning the majority of the popular vote in back-to-back elections, something that wouldn't happen again for more than 40 years. The outcome of this election, though, had more than just the effect of re-electing Jackson, but it also ignited the passion within his opponents to join together in opposition to him. The remaining parties, the National Republicans, the Anti-Masons, some of the Jacksonians who were no longer on board with his reforms, and a handful of the lingering Federalists still hanging out in New England, created the Whig Party, WHIG. This party was a party formed primarily to oppose Jackson and his reforms, and was named after the Whig Party in England, which was formed to oppose the king. So you can see where they got their name from and what they're implying about their feelings toward Andrew Jackson. This will usher in the second two-party system in the United States. Ever since James Monroe had become president 20 years earlier, the U.S. had been primarily a one-party country. But now, the nation will see itself split once again, all thanks to President Andrew Jackson. Next week, in episode 128, we will start to dive into the second term of Andrew Jackson and see how he continues to push his vision forward for the United States. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. The Teacher's History of the United States podcast is supported by its fans at patreon.com/teachershistory. Those of you who are able to contribute, I can't thank you enough, as it keeps this podcast going and allows me to continue to make time to try to provide you with the most in-depth and comprehensive history of our nation that I possibly can. A special thanks to our patrons at the history nerd level who sacrifice to really help keep this podcast going. Rita Huckle, Tammy Smith, Norm McLaughlin, and Pamela Caldwell. Thanks, Mom.